Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Menor. And I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite fantasy trilogies today. I'm going to be talking about Joe Abercrombie's The First Law Trilogy. I was reminded of this the other day. I was invited last Wednesday onto Mike's book reviews, his channel, in his segment Talk About Nothing, where he invites folks to come on and talk about nothing. And he invited me, and it was a good time. I enjoyed it quite a bit. Unfortunately, there were some technical difficulties. Mike sounded great, but I sounded like I was broadcasting from the dark side of the moon. That was unfortunate, but it was still fun. And we talked a little bit about this series, Joe Abercrombie's The First Law series. And I've never really talked about this at any length, so I thought, why not? It is one of my favorite books. I do consider the First Law trilogy to be one book because it does tell one story, much like The Lord of the Rings tells one story. This tells one story as well. A very different story, a very different kind of fantasy, but it does tell one story. So yeah, let's get into this series by Joe Abercrombie. It starts off with The Blade itself. It continues with Before They Are Hanged, and this is a better book than the first one is. And the third book is even better than that. This is The Last Argument of Kings. And the edition I got is the 10th anniversary edition, which I'll talk a little bit about. But first, I'll talk about the trilogy itself, which starts off with this book, The Blade itself. So this is what has become known as a grim, dark fantasy. This has become quite an influential trilogy. I'm not quite sure exactly what grim dark is, other than it's grim and it's dark. Everybody seems to have a different opinion about what that means. Of course, grim and dark fantasies have existed forever. Robert E. Howard wrote a lot of dark fantasies. And Michael Moorcock definitely wrote a lot of dark fantasies, as did his contemporary Carl Edward Wagner in his Kane series. So you could say this kind of thing has been around a long time. Joe Abercrombie did a little something different in his series, though. These are grim, they are dark, that is true, but they're also really funny. There is a lot of humor in these stories. Or in this series. And the series is also a very human series. It is very character-based. And all of the characters are really interesting and really flawed characters. The series itself, or the trilogy itself, tells one fantasy story that subverts a lot of your expectations if you're going into it expecting it to be a typical fantasy story that you might read from the 900 other authors who are writing fantasy stories nowadays. This one is quite different, and I think that's one of the reasons it's had an impact. It's not as popular as I think it ought to be. It's probably not as well known or respected as it should be, even among fantasy fans. But Joe Abercrombie's fans are really diehard fans. The people who like his stuff really, really like his stuff. And this series is really good. Like I said, it is character-based. It has a lot of interesting characters in it. Logan Ninefingers, who is a barbarian who is nothing like Conan the Barbarian. He's actually, as he's presented in this first book, you get the feeling he's kind of a big, friendly guy in a way, but he's also an insane maniac. And how that plays out, and just how frightening this character can be, as well as being as well as a character who seems pretty personable and who you might want to hang out with. Well, it turns out the deeper you get into the series, well, maybe you don't want to hang out with this guy because he's crazy. So Logan Ninefingers is really interesting. One of the most interesting characters you'll find in a fantasy series. And then you also have Jazal, who is the snotty rich kid who thinks he's great and is so terribly vain that you don't think you're ever going to like this guy. You end up liking this guy. And you really feel for this character by the end of this series. He started off just somebody you wouldn't want to hang out with at all because he's just so, snobby and rich and awful. But he's very human. He becomes very humanized throughout the series. And by the last book, when he reaches, does he reach the pinnacle of his career? Or is his end in the series a tragic one? But probably the most interesting character in this series is Sandan Glokta. Glokta is a torturer. A character that in any other series would just be straight up the villain. And he was at one time a dashing, heroic warrior who was captured by the enemy and tortured and tortured and tortured some more. He is a broken man physically and mentally. So when he returns home, he is literally broken and he becomes a torturer. And also a really interesting character. And like I said, in any other series, this character would just straight up be the villain. And he is kind of that, but he's a lot more than that. And by the end of the series, you kind of wonder, is this character actually, has he been the protagonist of this series the whole time? Is he the hero? If this series even has one, if this trilogy even has one. And of course there's Colum West. West, who seems like the most decent and personable guy in this whole series. Even he has some serious flaws. All the characters in this trilogy are deeply flawed. And that is interesting. And by the second book, by the time you get to this book, a lot of these characters who you don't think in the beginning perhaps that you would ever be rooting for, you end up rooting for them. You become really invested in all of their stories and their parts in this story. And the story itself, like I said, really is a story that will subvert your expectations if you're going into this expecting it to run like a typical fantasy story does. Joe Abercrombie takes a lot of the fantasy tropes and deliberately subverts them, which is fun. And you can tell that he's having a good time while he's doing it. And while this has a bunch of horrific violence and darkness, it also, like I said, has a tremendous amount of humor. And so it's literally a book, the First Law Trilogy, that I laughed out loud in more than once, which I never do. I did in this book because it has some really funny parts in it. Excellent humor, excellent characters, and an interesting plot once you get to it. Now, this first book in the series, The Blade itself, has taken some criticism because it starts off a little uneven, and for a long time while you're reading this first book, you're wondering if this book even has a plot at all. It does, but it takes a while to get to. This is true. A lot of this first book, he's introducing the world and introducing the characters. Now, how all of this stuff that he's introducing fits together doesn't become clear until later. There's a couple things going on, I think, in this book, The Blade itself. For one thing, I think Joe Abercrombie, while he obviously had skill as a writer to start off with, I think he was learning how to write a novel as he was writing this novel. And you get a sense of that from a couple things. One is the pacing. The pacing in the back half of this book and in the rest of the series is really, really good. But it's a little plodding a little bit in the first half of this book. It takes a little while to start rolling. And I think that was just him figuring out how to tell the story as he was telling it. The same could be said with some of the action. In the First Law Trilogy, there's some of the best written action you will ever find. Abercrombie is great at writing action, but he does get better at it. And you can tell that just from if you compare the action in the first part of The Blade itself with some of the action at the end of The Blade itself. You'll notice that the action at the end is a lot more immersive. It's frankly just better written, and it's a lot more involving. And it just rolls along a lot better than the action you'll find in the very beginning of this book. And if you compare the different scenes in this book, I think that's pretty clear. As he goes forward, he has a really good handle on action. And action is not something that's easy to do. A lot of writers have a hard time with action. But fortunately, Abercrombie is one of those authors who's really, really good at it. Once he gets good at it, which he does in this book. So there's that. But this is an interesting book because Abercrombie, he's obviously influenced heavily by George R.R. Martin. That's clear, and he has said so. But he's also very influenced by a lot of different things and different kinds of books, crime novels and other kinds of novels. Classic novels. You can see the influence of those works in here in the way this book is written and some of the things you'll find in this book. It doesn't always read, in fact, it almost never reads like a typical fantasy novel. It reads very differently than that. And I think that shows the influences, his varied influences in these books. And it works. It works really well for the presentation of this world, which is an interesting world, an interesting fantasy world. It feels realistic when you're reading it. And like I said, it's a very human story, despite having all of these terribly flawed characters, and probably because of that. It's really interesting the way the human stories are told. For example, there's a scene between Gollancz West and Sandan Glokta. They were once friends when they were both soldiers, before Glokta's capture and torture. Now, when Glokta got back, he thought that all of his friends had abandoned him, including West. But something very different was going on. And when West and Glokta finally have a talk about it and kind of clear the air about what had actually happened, it's a tremendously affecting scene. It was just so well done, and it hits you emotionally. And it's that stuff that makes you realize, this Abercrombie guy, he could write. He could write a book, this guy. He pulls off scenes like that all throughout this trilogy. Of course, he continued on with the First Law world after the trilogy. He had a series of standalone novels, and then he had a second trilogy, which I think just concluded recently. I haven't read them all. I intend to, though, of course, because this one was fantastic, and I highly recommend it, both for fantasy and non-fantasy fans alike. I mean, if you just like reading an engaging story, this could be for you. So as far as the edition goes, the one I got is the 10th anniversary edition that was published by Gollancz. Because I did want a hardcover edition. I wanted as nice of an edition as I could find. Unfortunately, this trilogy of books isn't highly regarded enough, I suppose, to have earned a Folio Society edition like A Song of Ice and Fire has. I wish it would. I would love nothing more than a Folio Society edition of the First Law Trilogy. Instead, we get Gollancz. Now, the thing about Gollancz is that they make very attractive, cheaply made books. Their books tend to be cheaply made. Cheap paper, cheap binding. That is just a cold, hard fact. That's how Gollancz hardcovers tend to be. But they do look really nice, and they probably are better than any other edition you can get right now, this 10th anniversary edition. Although I haven't checked out the first edition hardcovers, which are probably, as far as construction is concerned, better. Probably. But like I said, I haven't seen them. But these ones, the 10th anniversary editions, like I said, they look really nice. And they will probably serve, certainly, until Folio Society gets its act together and prints this, which they ought to, or at least Eastern Press. If Eastern Press would come out with this, that would be fantastic. That would make me very happy. But until then, we do have the 10th anniversary, which, like I said, is very pretty. These are very pretty volumes. You have to hand it to them for that. But however you get these, and they are readily available in paperback. The most recent paperbacks, in the US at least, don't have the greatest covers in my opinion. Some of the older ones do, and I like the British paperback covers. But they are readily available in paperback, readily available as ebooks, of course. However you can read these, you should read them because they're really good. Okay, I guess that's all I have to say about the First Law Trilogy at this particular time. Thank you, my friends, for joining me this morning, and I will catch you next time.